Good morning. Delighted to see all of you here today. Julia Randle is in fine form. She has her voice this day. We've just been chatting about the fact that I presume most of you understand or have some understanding, again, going back to your days either in college, maybe some of you did some graduate work, and remember those theses, those big papers you had to do, had to be at least 20 pages, right? Those when you were freshmen, they were just staggering. And then how you learned how to stretch the columns a little bit wider and to make the 20 pages out of maybe a 12-pager, something like that. Well, Julia's been doing this research for quite some time, of course, and what she's learning is that, and she's continuing to do the research, and so the material, actually, she could give you a 40-pager today. And what she's decided to do is she's going to break what she was going to try to squeeze in today into, she's going to do half of it, and then we're going to stretch out our series a little bit longer than originally anticipated. She is gleaning lots of really important material, and then before all is said and done, we need to, as a congregation, come together and have a conversation. There's more that needs to happen after this, and we need to be wise and discerning about that. We need to be prayerful about that, where we go from here. But thanks be to God for Julia Randle and her interest on a day like today, even though it's pretty cold out there. She will spend time in libraries when the rest of us would love to be outside doing something outside. She's inside doing her research. Thanks be to God for that, Julia Randle. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your very kind introduction. But before I go any further, I would like to start with prayer. And using from the prayer book, the prayer for the human family. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. And Lord, may my lips speak only truth to my hearers, and my hearers only hear truth from me. Amen. Thank you, John, for your very kind introduction. I apologize for last week, but trust me, you did not want to see me, and you would not have heard me as I was mute. And from what I hear, John more than adequately filled my shoes. I hear that he stepped up to the plate, pulled a Bryce Harper, and hit one out of the park. Thank you, John. Your MVP is coming. And as usual, I have kudos to people who have helped me. Ann Shine is not here. She's away. She's not sick because she brought me things by request and kind of gingerly pulled them out to me. And kudos, too, to Margaret Hudak, who has been helping me with research as a service project. And she's learned, I think, two very important things. Doing history means going through mountains of things to get little teeny nuggets. And as she's been reading vestry minutes from the days in the 20th century when they were handwritten in big volumes, that the register of the vestry was not chosen on the basis of their handwriting. Right, Margaret? Well, as John has indicated, I'm not going to go through all of our racial history today from the Civil War to the present. I'm going to stop on the advent of Brown versus Board, 1954, because in many ways, this is a story about a particular congregation and us. The Civil War ended, and we were part of a whole new set of relationships between people. And the basic issue, when you think about it, was really power and control. Who had the power to control their lives? The slaves were free in Virginia, and since we're in Virginia, that's how we'll talk, and eager to embrace this power and control over their lives. The whites, however, were used to having that power and control and were not rushing to give it up. That's not where their world was. So the way this played out in religious life was this. Many African Americans wanted to form their own congregations, their own worshiping communities. They had spent bondage years primarily hearing from white preachers a narrow portion of the gospel, focused on obedience to their master, their white master here on earth, as well as their master in heaven. They knew there was more to the gospel. They wanted to hear that, and they wanted to hear it from someone who looked like them, someone who had their experience in life, someone who understood their trials and travails. And they also wanted to worship in a style that fed their needs, that might be a little different from the average Caucasian. And those were all aspects of this new life. And scholars have shown over and over that what happened is most blacks formed these communities separate from the white community. It wasn't that the whites were pushing them out, far be it. In fact, there's evidence that they were very hurt that the African Americans left their congregations. But they formed, to some degree, they formed new denominations like that were focused on race, or specifically congregations within a larger denomination, that were primarily one race. Now, this was even a little more complicated in the Episcopal Church world, because you start in the Episcopal Church with ordaining by a bishop who has certain standards for a priest to be ordained, which is based on education. And during slavery, that kind of education, particularly reading, was denied to the slave. So you have this whole, getting an African American Episcopal priest around to minister. So that's a problem. And there wasn't a seminary for Episcopalians of color in Virginia until 1878 and the founding of Bishop Payne Divinity School. Okay, now you could read for orders, but the white community was not ready, could not conceive of, whatever you want to call it, African Americans studying for the priesthood at Virginia Theological Seminary. That's just the way it was. So what happens in the next few years is, and for the next 100 years, is the story of Christ Church and Meade Memorial. Now, this is an interactive moment. By show of hands, how many of you have been inside Meade Memorial? I am stunned. I expected it to be less, and I am inordinately pleased. Because Meade is our child. Meade is our congregational offspring of the post-Civil War years. It didn't start out as a racially defined church, but it became one. Now, there are conflicting stories about its origin. There are some stories in the Meade community that it somehow was formed from actions by a Colonel Meade, General George Meade, someone named Meade, who wanted a place for African Americans to worship. I have not been able to document that story in any way, shape, or form. But then there are plenty of stories that we have about ourselves that I can't document either. And these stories about such things always have some kind of nugget of truth and also speak to aspirations and needs of the people who are telling that story. Maybe someday I'll know the whole piece on that part of the story. But at this point, if you go onto Meade's website and click on history, you'll find the basis of this lecture with me as a byline and all the footnotes you'd ever want to hear or read, excuse me, and I'm not going to give them here. The story starts in the winter of 1869-70, when Christ Church establishes a mission in the northern part of the city of Alexandria at Columbus and Montgomery Streets. That was the turning basin where canal boats would turn, and it was a wider part of the canal. And it was an area of great commerce, industry, and rivermen, sailors, mariners, people associated with water traffic. And this mission was intended to minister to those people. And it was done with the help of Grace, St. Paul's here in Alexandria, and Christ Church, Baltimore. Together, the money was raised, about $1,100, to build a church there that seated between 150 and 170 people. And since it was paid for, it was consecrated May 22nd, 1870 by Bishop Johns. And at that time, it was named Meade Memorial Church in honor of Bishop William Meade, 3rd Bishop of Virginia, and a former rector of this place for whom this room is named. He was a vital part of our history, and he was a very vital part of the diocese. And in retrospect, you might think it was named for Meade because he was very much an advocate of and firm believer in the white master's duty to provide the gospel to his bondsmen. But then this wasn't intended to be an African American church. It was intended to be a church. And in the early years, it was an interracial church. There's evidence that both blacks and whites worshiped there together. Well, in 1871-72, something else happened. And that was a colored, an African American, a black, whichever one word you prefer to use, a Sunday school for people of color was founded under Christ Church, by Christ Church people. I don't know where it was. I do know that it existed, and it was directed by a member of the congregation, John Janney Lloyd, of the Lloyd family of the Lloyd House down the way. They were not doing well financially, so he couldn't afford to go to VTS to prepare for the ministry. He read for orders under the rector of Christ Church and organized this Sunday school, which was staffed by members of the congregation. And since we only had about a half a dozen African Americans in the congregation at that time, it was staffed by the white people. So it grew. It grew and grew, and in November of 1872, he came to the vestry and said, there are a lot of colored persons who expressed the desire that we would furnish a suitable place to be used as an Episcopal church for colored persons. And the vestry said, okay, Meade Chapel may be placed at their disposal for 1 year, provided the signatures of not less than 50 persons of age 16 years and over can be obtained, promising to make that their regular place of worship, and provided further that they pay for the fuel. Yeah, we'll let you have the building, but you got to keep it warm. Okay. By the spring of 1873, they had those signatures within 6 months. So the African American community, building upon this Sunday school, said, we want our own church. Okay. Well, for reasons not found in any of the materials I've encountered, and I've been looking at this for 20 years, they didn't worship henceforth at the basin by the canal. The church was physically moved to Columbus and Princess Streets. Maybe there was some problem with the neighborhood. Maybe this was closer to the African Americans who wished to worship there. Maybe it was closer to Christ Church to keep an eye on it. I don't know. But it was put on rollers and moved down Columbus Street. And it took a while, from April 22nd to May 13th. And they put it on this plot of land on the northeast corner of Columbus and Princess Streets. Now, the neighborhood at the time was not enthusiastic about this either. They protested to Christ Church. But as sources in the Alexandria Gazette have said, no other place could be found, and it was put there. And somehow Christ Church convinced the neighborhood that it would be okay. So here it was put on this plot of land that was given by a Christ Church parishioner, Anna Maria Fitzhugh of Ravensworth, out in Fairfax County. If you were here a couple weeks ago, it was at her plantation where the rector once went and baptized 22 of her slaves. This is a continuation of her interest and her ministry. And oh yes, she was the aunt of Mrs. Robert E. Lee. Yeah. Well, the church reopened on Sunday, May 18th, and had a visitation from the Bishop of Virginia, Bishop John Johns, who confirmed 2 African Americans in the congregation named Jane and William Rowland. But it was now clearly going to be a church of African Americans. The few remaining African Americans who had continued in the Christ Church congregation were transferred from Christ Church to Meade. And those whites who had been worshiping at Meade as a part of the mission were transferred to Christ Church. So you had two very separate, racially distinct congregations. And that's how things progressed. Much of the early work at Meade was focused on both religion and education. You had a Sunday school, which was seen to be booming, which would have 50 to 90 children every year. And most of the teachers were white, primarily women, from Christ Church. Some of the teachers were colored, were black, but most of them were white, and they worked together with these African American children. Also, a parish school was formed to provide basic education for these children during the week when, local schools were not receiving African American children for basic education. And the school, once again, was staffed by both African Americans and whites from Christ Church. And this continues with oversight by Christ Church clergy and seminarians from Virginia Theological Seminary. The rector would go at times to Meade for giving communion, and the seminarians would do the services at the other times as lay readers and sometimes as deacons. And the services would be held on late Sunday afternoons and on Friday nights to fit in with the seminarian schedule of study and work. And so that continues until they finally have their first African American leader in the pulpit, a man named John Pollard. He was reading for orders under the rector of Christ Church, William Meade Dame. You know who he was named for. And he came there first as an educator. His background was teaching. So he was first attached to the school, and then, through reading for orders, was ordained a deacon at VTS on June 28, 1878. So they had their first ordained leader. But he didn't stay very long because he wanted to complete his education, and he went where he could get it. Bishop Payne Divinity School, which had been recently opened in Petersburg, Virginia. So you have this, what happens after that is ups and downs, because once again, there are not a big cadre of African American clergy out there. There are not a lot of white Episcopal clergy in Virginia either, and the ones that got them were the ones that could pay them the bucks. And that was not a chapel of Christ Church. So you continued off and on with this, the rector of Christ Church providing Eucharist at stated times, and periodically African Americans who had now been to Bishop Payne Divinity School or who were going to Bishop Payne Divinity School serving at Meade. You had a Walter Burwell in 1886-87, and then you had William Patterson Burke, who was there from 1889 to 1992. That would be the apogee of Meade's life in some respects during the late 19th century, because he was ordained a priest, not just a deacon, a priest. He was ordained at Meade on February 13th, 1890. So they saw their own people becoming a full priest of the church and ministering to them. So apparently Christ Church said, okay, we can step back. Well, think again. He got a better job elsewhere. and Meade slipped back into mission status under Christ Church. And that is something that would happen off and on throughout the rest of Meade's history, whether slipping back into mission status under Christ Church or under someone else. You'll have mission status and separate congregation status and mission status. You need about 3 computers to keep it all straight, because it happens many times. It's the challenge of an African American congregation. But somehow a revitalization again started in the early 20th century. New clergy came, and there was a great interest, or a greater interest, manifested by Christ Church. By 1907, it was clear that Old Chapel that had rolled up Columbus Street was falling apart and needed to be replaced. And be replaced by a substantive building, a brick building, not a little clapboard affair like they'd been worshiping in all these years. And so a committee was formed of Christ Church, St. Paul's, and Grace to raise approximately $10,000 to build this church. Now that took a while, and interesting people donated to it. In 1909, Arthur Selden Lloyd, John Janney Lloyd's brother, was consecrated Bishop Coadjutor of Virginia. He was consecrated here at Christ Church, and the offering that day was for the building fund for Meade Memorial. Oh yes, and someone else gave a little money. It's in the vestry minutes. A lady who gave us some money a little later, a lady named Mary Custis Lee. She specifically gave $50, which in those days would be a lot more than it is, in these days it would be a lot more, specifically for the building of Meade. A lot was purchased at the corner of Princess and Alfred Street, where Meade Memorial is today. And the church building was built and was staffed and had a much more, or at least a less spotty life of black clergy leadership from that time forward. And it seems to me from the records of Christ Church that perhaps interest seemed to languish on our part. Maybe we thought, we've done our duty. They have their building. Or maybe we were interested in something else. Meade begins to vanish from the Christ Church records. Okay. Well, they would come to us periodically and say, we need some money. We need some money for this project. We need some money for that project. We need a parish hall. Help us build it. And we'd say, that's a nice idea. We'll form a committee. But don't take that too much as pushing them away, because simultaneously, Christ Church was looking at the same problem, need for parish hall. This was the parish hall, and that's where all the Sunday school and all of the activities took place. Built in 1854, it was aging and inadequate to our needs, and we were wrestling with the same problem. We could not afford to build that new parish hall until 1950. So us saying, well, let's form a committee, we were doing the same thing to ourselves. there was something of an even-handed treatment there. Now keep in mind, we owned that church. Our trustees held the title. We were the owners of Meade Memorial Church. So of course, when they wanted to fix the leaky roof, we were more than happy. We didn't form a committee, we gave them money. And we paid the insurance too. But that role ended in 1945. When changes in diocesan canon were such that the diocese asked us to deed Meade Memorial to the diocese. And on November 25th, 1945, congregation meeting was held and the vote was taken to yes, deed that church to the Diocese of Virginia and have the Diocese of Virginia have the responsibility. Now you might say, well, was this an unusual way for African American churches to live and serve in the Diocese of Virginia at that time? And the answer is, well, it was in many ways kind of typical. The white community had the resources and basically more of the power. The African Americans were struggling, trying to get the resources and have the power themselves, but they were in increasingly segregated spheres. And this happened across the Episcopal Church, not just in Virginia. In the 1880s, there was a movement to have black churches, African American churches, in some kind of separate organization, maybe a super diocese that covered the country with just had black churches. That was one idea, kind of like dioceses we have today for Native American reservations. But what happened more frequently was in specific dioceses, African American churches were segregated into a special unit of the diocese called something like an archdeaconry for colored work, something like that. And it would often have an archdeacon for the colored work who was African American, who served those people and worked with them. So you had this separation structurally within the Episcopal Church. And that happened in Virginia. In 1888, 1889, there was constitutional change in this diocese. Up to that point, all African American congregations and ministers, like everyone else in the diocese, had its canonical representatives at this annual meeting that determines policy, direction, canons of the Diocese of Virginia. Well, constitutional changes were passed that put these African Americans in a colored missionary jurisdiction from which they could elect representation to that council of 2 ministers and 2 members of the laity. Period. End of discussion. Even the clergy would be denied their rightful seat in the council of the church. Now, the ones that were already there were grandfathered in, but they saw the writing on the wall, and they left the diocese. And that effectively disenfranchised blacks on both levels of ministry in the councils of the Diocese of Virginia. And that continues until 1949, when all references to race were removed from the diocesan constitution and canons, and including the colored missionary jurisdiction. And oh yes, we did have an archdeacon for colored work in Virginia, and for all but 18 months the person was white. And for a little while, it was John Janney Lloyd of earlier Meade Memorial fame. Now, I have looked at the vestry minutes for that entire period up to 1949. In that time period, the Christ Church vestry instructed its delegate, at that point it was one, to the diocesan council on what and how to vote. Once in the 20s, they instructed the delegate to make really sure in this prayer book revision that the Diocese of Virginia tell the general church to keep the 39 articles. Okay. And in the 30s, they instructed our delegate to go to council and make sure our quota, we didn't have pledges in those days, we had quotas of support assigned by the diocese to try and get our quota reduced. The other three instructions were on who could be a member of the diocesan council. In 1889, our vestry instructed its delegate to vote for that segregation in the diocesan council. There was another movement. There was an increasing movement to change that, and it was coming up in 1932. And once again, our vestry instructed its delegate to vote against integration. And at the same time, this is the fifth time they gave a vote instruction, they instructed it to vote for giving Army chaplains, headmasters, and diocesan administrative officials seats in the council to which they would not admit blacks. That was our life up to, I'll say, up to Brown versus Board, which we'll talk about another Sunday. But we had this relationship with an African American congregation. In many ways, we birthed it, we enabled it, we gave it a place. We worked with it in many different ways. And then it no longer was our responsibility. But we weren't rushing out to integrate. Not hardly. We were people of our time. Thank you all.